And so we're going to see those choices starkly this week.
Here on C-SPAN 2, the U.S. Senate gaveling in next to take up the nomination of Cornelia T.L. to be a judge for the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Also debate and action later today on an FDA bill. Live coverage on C-SPAN 2.
Let us pray. Our Father, we wait in reverence before your throne. Cleanse us from our sins, creating in us clean hearts while renewing a right spirit within us. Lord, help our lawmakers today to discern your voice and do your will. Give them the ability to differentiate your guidance from all others, permitting you to lead them to your desired destination. Speak to them through your word. Guide them with your spirit and sustain them with your might. Let all they do be well done, fit for your eyes to see, and receiving your divine approbation. And Lord, we ask you to comfort Senator and Mrs. Inhofe as they grieve the death of their son. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to calendar number 236, the drug compounding legislation.
Clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 236, H.R. 3204, an act to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act with respect to human drug compounding and drug supply chain security and for other purposes.
Mr. President, following leader remarks, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 4:30 this afternoon. At 4:30, the Senate will proceed to executive session and consider the nomination of Cornelia T.L. to be United States Circuit Judge for the District of Columbia. At 5:30, there will be a cloture vote on the T.L. nomination. If cloture is not invoked, there will be a second cloture vote on the motion to proceed with the drug compounding bill. Mr. President, I'm told that S. 1661 is due for a second reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
S. 1661, a bill to require the Secretary of State to offer rewards up to $5 million for information regarding the attacks on the United States diplomatic mission at Benghazi, Libya, and that began on September 11, 2012.
Mr. President, I would object to any further proceedings with respect to this legislation.
Objection is heard. The bill will be placed on the calendar.
Mr. President, I extend my condolences to Jim Inhofe, senior senator from Oklahoma, and his wife Kay on the loss of their son Perry. The entire Senate family was saddened to hear of Dr. Inhofe's death. He was a young man, 52 years of age, killed in a plane crash early Sunday. Flying airplanes is in the blood of Jim Inhofe and his family. I really care a lot about Jim Inhofe. He and I are unquestionably friends. We may not agree on all political issues, but we agree that we're friends. I have had the good fortune of working to get to know this good man. I've helped him when I could. He's helped me when he can. And we put all of the disagreements to one side and look at each other for what we are outside of our politics. I have confidence that he's going to do well. He's a man of great faith, and I feel comfortable that he will be able to work his way through this. Madam President, my heart also goes out to the residents of the Philippines who were drastically affected by this terrible, terrible storm that hit one or two or three of their islands over the weekend. The Philippines has 7,000 islands, Madam President. The heavily populated area of Manila was not hit, at least very badly. We know that there are thousands of Filipinos dead and missing. Relief and construction efforts will be long and difficult. My thoughts are with approximately 3.5 million Filipinos in America today, Filipino Americans living with us, including in Nevada about 100,000 Filipino Americans. They are involved in so many important things in the healthcare field, business field, in the hotel business. So they are troubled. They may not have lost family members, but they're a community that is concerned every day about what's going on from this nation. They moved from there to here, the United States. I was happy to hear the administration has already moved in with support aid for this beleaguered nation. Later today, Madam President, we're going to attempt again to break a filibuster on the highly qualified person that has been asked by the President to serve in the D.C. Circuit. It's often said that the D.C. Circuit is the second highest court in the land after the Supreme Court, and that's true. It's unfortunate the Republicans have chosen to filibuster the nomination of yet another talented female jurist and dedicated public servant to fill a vacant seat on this court. The nominee, Georgetown law professor Nina Pillard, has argued 9 cases before the Supreme Court. She's briefed more than a score of cases. In one case, she argued before the Supreme Court, it involved a male employee of the state of Nevada who was fired after taking unpaid leave to care for his wife who was sick. Important case, landmark case. The court ruled 6-3 in favor of her client, upholding important protections under the Family Medical Leave Act. Support for Professor Pillard's nomination is bipartisan, at least outside the United States Senate. Yet, Senate Republicans seem poised to block confirmation of this eminently qualified woman for a blatantly political reason to deny President Obama his constitutional right to appoint judges. The D.C. Circuit is currently operating with a really bad ratio. We have 3 vacancies on this very important court. For the Republicans now to claim that we don't need 11 judges is a little strange, because that isn't what they said when President Bush was president and he needed these vacancies filled. They were filled. They happily filled the 9th, 10th, and 11th seats on the D.C. Circuit, the same 3 seats President Obama seeks to fill today, even though the court had a smaller caseload, significantly smaller caseload at the time. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts was one of the judges confirmed to the D.C. Circuit during George Bush's presidency. But since a Democrat was elected to the White House, Republicans have blocked 2 exceedingly qualified female nominees to the D.C. Circuit, Caitlin Halligan and Patricia Millett. In the last 19 years, 5 men have been confirmed to the D.C. Circuit, 1 woman. Today, the Senate has an opportunity to help shape a court that better reflects our country. So I hope that they'll not block another qualified female nominee for nakedly partisan reasons. The lead Senate Republicans owe Professor Pillard is the same fair confirmation process that Chief Justice Roberts enjoyed when he was nominated to the D.C. Circuit. Madam President, should Republicans block her confirmation, as I fear they will, the Senate will then vote on cloture on the motion to proceed to a bill to enhance safeguards at compounding pharmacies, which create custom-tailored medications for patients with unique health needs. This bipartisan legislation will ensure drugs manufactured in factories and mixed in pharmacies across the country are really safe for consumers. The measure will also implement tracking of medicines from the factory to the drugstore itself. Last year, unsanitary conditions at a compounding pharmacy led to a fungal meningitis outbreak that killed 64 people and very, very badly sickened more than 750 others. Contaminated medicine mixed at that pharmacy was sent to 75 medical facilities in 23 states and given to 14,000 patients. The facility in question was actually skirting existing law and acting as a large-scale drug manufacturer rather than creating custom medications for individuals using products manufactured by other companies. By avoiding stricter regulations on drug manufacturers, companies like this one boost their profits by putting patients at risk. This legislation will end this dangerous practice and ensure drugs manufactured and mixed in America are completely safe from the assembly line to the drugstore. This bill could pass the Senate right now, but has been stalled by Republicans for more than a month. This legislation is truly a matter of life and death. Defense authorization, Madam President. We must finish this legislation quickly so we can wrap up consideration of the crucial defense authorization bill before Thanksgiving. I put senators on notice last week and the week before that we're going to do whatever it takes to accomplish exactly that, finish this bill, even if it means working this coming weekend and hopefully not the next weekend, but possibly that too. Further, we must ensure debate on the defense authorization bill is about our nation's defense and not extraneous issues. No senator should be allowed to jump the line and get a vote on his or her own amendment by threatening to delay action on the underlying bill. Nor should the Senate waste time debating amendments that are not relevant to defense. This measure ensures the safety of this nation and its dedicated service members and is more important than any one senator or any senator's parochial or political pet issues. I would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin.
The U.S. Senate gavelled in about 15 minutes ago. They heard from the majority leader there on the center of your screen, talking with Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader. We expect to hear from the Republican leader in a minute or two. The Senate today expecting to take up the nomination of Nina Pillard to be a judge for the Circuit Court of Appeals for D.C.
President.
The Republican leader.
Are we in a quorum call?
Yes, we are.
I ask consent that further procedures on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I'd like to start with a word of sympathy about the heartbreaking loss of Perry Inhofe, our colleague Jim Inhofe's son, killed in a plane crash on Sunday. Of course, we're all thinking of Jim and Kay, and the heartfelt prayers of the entire Senate family are with them and the entire Inhofe family at this very, very difficult time. Now, Madam President, despite the repeated promises of President Obama, millions of people are losing their health insurance they very much liked and were assured they could keep. It has been reported that so far 3.5 million Americans have lost their health insurance under Obamacare. That includes over 250,000 in my state of Kentucky, 1/3 in Florida, and almost 1 million people out in California. This is a serious problem that the President and congressional Democrats need to do something about. The obvious answer is repeal. But in the meantime, the legislation offered by Senator Ron Johnson would help Americans keep the plans they have and like. If the President and Senate Democrats are serious about helping the millions of Americans who've unexpectedly lost their insurance over the past several weeks, then they should support it. Unfortunately, they appear ready to ignore the problem. Rather than focusing on keeping their commitment to the American people, they're focusing on things that appeal to their base. Rather than change the law that is causing so many problems for so many, they want to change the subject. According to a recent report, our Democratic friends want to divert as much attention as possible away from the problem-plagued Obamacare rollout at this formative stage of the 2014 campaign, which brings us to the vote we're going to have later today. We'll not be voting on legislation to allow Americans to keep their health insurance if they like it, as they were promised again and again. Rather, we'll be voting on a nominee to a court that doesn't have enough work to do, a court so underworked that it regularly cancels oral argument days, a court whose judges tell us that if any more judges were put on the court, there wouldn't be enough work to go around, a court that is less busy now than it was when Senate Democrats pocket filibustered President Bush's nominee to the court, Peter Keisler, for 2 whole years, 2 long years. And it's less busy based upon the very standards that Democrats themselves set forth when they blocked Mr. Keisler's nomination for 2 years. By the way, it is also less busy now than it was then, according to an analysis provided by the chief judge of the court. So, Madam President, the Senate ought to be spending its time dealing with a real crisis, not a manufactured one. We ought to be dealing with an ill-conceived law that is causing millions of Americans to lose their health insurance. Instead, we'll spend our time today on a political exercise designed to distract the American people from the mess that is Obamacare rather than trying to fix it. If our Democratic colleagues are going to ignore the fact that millions of people are losing their health insurance plans, they should at least be working with us to fill judicial emergencies that actually exist, rather than complaining about fake ones. There are nominees on the executive calendar who would fill actual judicial emergencies. Unlike the Pillard nomination, some of them, in fact, have been pending on the calendar longer than the Pillard nomination. But rather than work with us to schedule votes on those nominations in an orderly manner, as we have been doing all year long, the majority prefers to concoct a crisis on the D.C. Circuit so it can try to distract the American people from the failings of Obamacare. Unfortunately, our friends appear to be more concerned with playing politics than actually solving real problems. So I'll be voting no on this afternoon's political exercise. I hope the Senate will focus on things the American people care about rather than spend its time trying to distract them. And finally, Madam President, I'd like to congratulate Archbishop Joseph Kurtz, the Catholic Archbishop of Louisville, on his election as president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Archbishop Kurtz isn't a native Kentuckian. He's originally from Pennsylvania, but we've adopted him as one of our own since he was appointed head of the Louisville Archdiocese in June of 2007. I wish him all the best as he seeks to promote the Church's mission in the United States. Congratulations. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 4:30 p.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each. The senator from Iowa.
I come to the floor to speak in opposition to the motion to invoke cloture on the nomination for the D.C. Circuit nominee Cornelia T.L. Although her record makes clear her views are well outside the mainstream on a host of issues, I'm not going to focus any attention on those concerns today. I'm going to focus instead on the standard the Democrats established in the year 2006. Based on that standard, the court's caseload makes clear that the workload simply doesn't justify additional judges, particularly when those additional judges cost approximately $1 million per year per judge. Now, I've walked through these statistics several times now, and I'm not going to go in depth again. The bottom line is this: the data overwhelmingly supports the conclusion that the D.C. Circuit is underworked. Everyone knows this is true. That circuit does not need any more judges. Now, take, for instance, the appeals filed and appeals terminated. In both categories, the D.C. Circuit ranks last. And in both categories, the D.C. Circuit is less than half the national average. To provide some perspective on this point, compare the D.C. Circuit to the 11th. After another judge took senior status about a week ago, both the D.C. Circuit and the 11th Circuit have 8 active judges. If we don't confirm any more judges to either court, the numbers remain the same as last year. The 11th Circuit will have 875 appeals per active judge compared to the 149 appeals filed per active judge in D.C., which also has 8 active judges. Again, that's 875 cases for the 11th compared to 149 for D.C. Now, some might argue that we shouldn't look only at active judges, because those averages will change if and when we confirm more judges to the 11th Circuit. Suppose we fill each judgeship on the 11th Circuit and each judgeship on the D.C. Circuit, as the Democrats want to do. If we fill them all, there would be 583 appeals filed per judge for the 11th Circuit and only 108 for the D.C. Circuit. The 11th Circuit then has over 5 times the caseload. This is why everyone who has looked at this objectively understands the caseload for the D.C. Circuit is stunningly low. That is why current judges on the court have written to me and said things like this, and I want to quote from one of the letters, quote, "If any more judges were added now, there wouldn't be enough work to go around," end of quote. Now, some of my friends on the other side recognize that the D.C. Circuit's caseload is low, and they claim then that the caseload numbers don't take into account the quote-unquote complexity of the court's docket. They argue that the D.C. Circuit hears more administrative appeals than other circuits do, and they claim these administrative appeals are more complex. This argument is nonsense, and I want to tell you why it's nonsense. I've heard my colleagues argue repeatedly that the D.C. Circuit's docket is complex because 43% of the docket is made up of administrative appeals. But of course, that is a high percentage of a very small number. When you look at the actual number of those so-called complex cases per judge, well, the Second Circuit has almost twice as many as the D.C. Circuit. In 2012, there were 512 administrative appeals filed in D.C. In the Second Circuit, there were 1,493 compared to that 512. Now, we can look at this differently as well. There were only, in D.C., there were only 64 administrative appeals per active judge. The Second Circuit has nearly twice as many per judge with 115. Again, that's 64 administrative appeals per active judge, D.C. Circuit, as opposed to the Second Circuit, which has almost twice as many with 115. So, this entire argument about complexity is what I already called it, nonsense, and the other side knows it, and if they don't know it, they ought to know it. Now let me raise another question regarding caseload. If these cases were really that hard, if these cases were really so complex, then why in the world would the D.C. Circuit take the entire summer off? And I'm not talking about just a couple weeks in August. They don't hear any cases for the entire summer. The D.C. Circuit has so few cases on their docket that they don't hear any cases from the middle of May until the second week of September. This past term, the last case they heard before taking the summer off was May 16th. The court didn't hear another case until September the 9th, 4 months later. The bottom line is this. Everyone knows this court doesn't have enough cases as it is, let alone if we would add more judges. That is why when you ask the current judges for their candid assessment, they write, and I say this again, quote, "If any more judges were confirmed now, there wouldn't be enough work to go around," end of quote. Now, while I'm discussing the caseload issue, I want to remind my colleagues of just a little bit of history, but very pertinent for this debate that's going on here. In 2006, the Democrats on the Judiciary Committee blocked Peter Keisler's nomination to the D.C. Circuit. They blocked Mr. Keisler's nomination based upon, would you guess it, the court's caseload. Since that time, by the standard set by the other side, the court's caseload has declined sharply. We didn't set this standard. The Democrats set that standard. I recognize that the other side wants to rewrite history. They tried to compare John Roberts' second nomination to the circuit, which passed fairly easily, with the current nomination. What they conveniently forget in a misleading way is that they blocked Keisler's nomination after Roberts' nomination. I recognize that the other side hopes that we on this side will forget that they established these rules and these precedents. I recognize that the other side finds those rules very, very inconvenient today. But these are not reasons to ignore rules and precedents that they establish. There is simply no legitimate reason that the other side should not embrace those very same rules, those very same standards that they established in the year 2006. So under that standard established by the Democrats in 2006, then very simply, these nominations are not needed. According to the current judges themselves, these judges are not needed. According to the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit, who happens to be a Clinton appointee, the senior judges are contributing the equivalent of an additional 3 1/4 judges. So, as a result, the court already has the equivalent of 11 1/4 judges, and that's way beyond, or that is beyond even the authorized number. So, it seems pretty clear that the other side has run out of legitimate arguments in support of these nominations. Perhaps that is why then they're resorting to such cheap tactics. Over the last couple of days, I've heard my colleagues on the other side actually come to the floor and actually argue that Republicans are opposing the nominee because of her gender. That argument is offensive, but you know, it tends to be very predictable. We've seen this before. When the other side runs out of legitimate arguments, their last line of defense is to accuse Republicans of opposing nominees based upon gender or race. It's an old and it's a well-worn card, and they play it every time. The fact of the matter is, and this is why it's offensive to me, is that I voted for 75 women nominated to the bench by President Obama, as well as a host of other nominees of diverse backgrounds. Those are the facts, but the other side isn't concerned with facts. They're more interested in coarse rhetoric as well as demagoguery. And it's very unfortunate. Those types of personal attacks on members of the Senate are beneath this institution. Now, given that there is no legitimate reason to fill these seats, why is the other side pushing these nominations so aggressively? And this is really the bottom line. But you can also ask, why waste $3 million a year of taxpayers' money for reasons that are not legitimate, particularly in violation of the constitutional checks and balances? Now, as to these other reasons, we don't have to guess. We know the reason. We've all heard the President pledge repeatedly, if Congress won't act, I will. What he means, of course, is that he will rule by executive fiat. He won't go to Congress. He won't negotiate. He'll go around this constitutionally elected body whose constitutional powers is to make law. That's not his power. He doesn't need legislators then to enact legislation. He'll just issue executive orders or issue new agency rules. Why bother with us pesky senators and members of the House when you can make laws with a stroke of the pen? In effect, the President is saying, if the Senate won't confirm who I want when I want them, then I'll recess appoint them when the Senate isn't even when the Senate is even in session. If Congress won't pass cap and trade fee increases, then I'll go around them. And I'll do the same thing through administrative action at the Environmental Protection Agency. If Congress won't pass gun control legislation, then I'll issue executive orders. That is what the President means when he says, if Congress won't act, I will. But remember, we have a system of checks and balances. Under our system, when the President issues orders by executive fiat, it's the courts that provide a check on his power. It's the courts that decide whether the President is acting unconstitutionally. So the only way the President's plan works is if he stacks the deck in his favor. The only way the President can successfully bypass Congress is if he stacks the court with ideological allies who will rubber stamp those executive orders. There is no big secret here. The other side hasn't been shy about this strategy. Here is how the Washington Post described this strategy. Quote, given liberals a greater say on the D.C. Circuit is important for Obama as he looks for ways to circumvent the Republican-led House and a polarized Senate on a number of policy fronts through executive order and other administrative procedures, end of quote. End of quote. Here's another high-profile administration ally put it, quote, there are few things more vital on the President's second-term agenda. With legislative priorities gridlocked in the Congress, the President's best hope for advancing his agenda is through executive action, and that runs through the D.C. Circuit. So the President is willing to waste $3 million of taxpayers' money a year and every year in order to bypass Congress and make sure his executive orders don't lose in court. Every member of this body should find that very, very troubling. Finally, I want to mention a couple of points on the so-called Gang of 14 agreement, which argument comes up quite frequently here on the floor, even though it's going back to the 109th Congress. First, by the very terms of that agreement, it applied only to those 14 senators for that specific Congress, the 109th. Second, even though that agreement by its own terms expired at the end of the 109th Congress, just last week, one of the members who was actually in the Senate back in 2005, determined that these nominations, in his judgment, constituted extraordinary circumstances, which those two words implied that a filibuster would be justified. And third, in 2006, after the so-called Gang of 14 agreement, Senate Democrats created a standard that we call the Chrysler Standard. They blocked Peter Chrysler based on caseload after the so-called Gang of 14 agreement. Peter Chrysler waited in committee for over 900 days for a vote that never came. These are the rules established by the other side. And now, when they're on the receiving end of those same rules, they want those rules changed. So, Madam President, we don't intend to play by two sets of rules around here. And that brings me the constant threat from the majority about changing the rules on the filibuster. I've been in the minority for a number of years. I've also had the privilege of serving the majority for a number of years. Many of those on the other side who are clamoring for rule change and almost falling over themselves to do it have never served a single day in the minority. All I can say is this: be careful what you wish for. I've come to the conclusion that if the rules are changed, at least we Republicans will get to use those new rules when we're back in the majority. Republicans had the chance 7 or 8 years ago to change the rules, and we decided, out of respect for the integrity of this institution, not to change them, and I'm glad we didn't. And I'd imagine we wouldn't be the first to change them in the future. Remember, it was the Democrats who first used the filibuster to defeat circuit judges. It was the Democrats who first used the caseload argument to defeat circuit judges like Peter Keisler. So if the Democrats are bent on changing the rules, then I say, go ahead. There are a lot more Scalias and Thomases out there that we'd love to put on the bench. The nominees we'd nominate and confirm with 51 votes will interpret the Constitution as it was written. They're not the type who would invent constitutional law right out of thin air. I urge my colleagues to oppose cloture on pillared nomination. I yield the floor.
The absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate in a period of morning business with the senators coming to the floor to speak. We heard from the Democratic leader Harry Reid and also from Mitch McConnell. The Senate today likely to begin taking up the nomination of Cornelia T.L. to be a judge for the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Also expecting a vote later today on a motion to proceed to debate on a bill that would expand the FDA's oversight of compounding pharmacies.
Senator from Iowa.
I ask that further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
First of all, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that Nathan Brown, detailee on my staff, be granted 4 privileges for the duration of the consideration of H.R. 3204, the Drug Quality and Security Act.
Without objection.
And I ask unanimous consent that Tatiana Lowell Campbell and Benjamin Friedman of my staff be granted floor privileges for the duration of today's session.
Without objection.
Madam President, I have high hopes that the Senate will soon vote to enact the Drug Quality and Security Act, so-called compounding and trace and track bill. This legislation helps ensure the safety of compounded drug products, and it also secures the pharmaceutical supply chain. I am pleased to report that it's the product of excellent bipartisan collaboration on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, where I worked very closely with our ranking member, my good friend, Senator Lamar Alexander. It also reflects productive conversations with our colleagues in the House, including Chairman Upton and Ranking Member Waxman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. The House passed this bill on September 28th, and now it's our turn to do our part. Madam President, Title I of the bill addresses drug compounding. And this is basically what happened here just over a year ago when we were shocked to learn one of the worst public health crises that we have experienced in recent years. It was a meningitis outbreak that claimed the lives of 64 Americans, sickened 751 people in 20 states. And you can see the hardest hit were the home state of Senator Alexander, 153, Indiana 93, Michigan 264, Virginia 54, New Jersey 51, Florida 25, but 20 states. And a lot of people got really, really sick. And I'll be talking just in a minute about some of those that still linger today. Well, what this outbreak did is it brought attention to the legal and regulatory gaps that allowed owners and managers at the New England Compounding Center to disregard basic procedures to ensure that the products they were manufacturing were sterile and safe. And this gross negligence had heartbreaking consequences for families nationwide. Patients that were sickened, patients like Karina Baxter, whose 3 adult children, Anita, Andrew, and Brian, lost their mother, and whose community lost a dedicated math teacher and tutor when she died of this meningitis outbreak, age 56. Dawn Elliott from Indiana, who used to scuba dive in her free time but is now in unrelenting pain, has had to give up her job and deplete her savings. Evelyn Bates from Michigan, who was diagnosed last November, continues to struggle with tremendous pain every day, and whose daughter had to quit her job to take care of her. Dennis Blatt, who lives on the West Virginia-Ohio border with his wife and 3 young children. They've had to watch their father go from being an involved parent with a steady income to a man whose daily life feels, in his own words, like a slow, torturous death. So these meningitis outbreaks linger on. It always also has a kind of a personal sensitivity to me. My older brother, some years ago, went deaf at a very young age because of meningitis. So it has lingering effects for a lifetime. So that's what happened a little over a year ago. Although we know that it wasn't just an isolated incident, it was the biggest. But this chart, which is kind of hard to read, it just shows it going clear back to 2001. We've had 4, 11, 64, 18. In other words, every year we've had some results that we've noted from compounding that made people sick or caused deaths. So this has been ongoing for a long time. It's just that what happened a little over a year ago in Tennessee and these other states was sort of the dam broke. It just beyond all comprehension how many people got sick and died. So again, in response to these facts, beginning last year, Senator Alexander and I convened the members of the Health Committee with assistance from Senators Franken and Senator Roberts in an effort to identify the gaps in current policy, to solicit stakeholder views, craft bipartisan legislation to better ensure the quality of compounded drug products. We formally solicited 3 rounds of public comment, and we held 2 public hearings before marking up the bill last May. Then over the summer, we worked with our colleagues in the House to craft a package with strong bipartisan and bicameral support. Now, the compounding provisions in this bill are an unqualified step forward from current law and practice. Basically, what this bill does in the compounding in Title I, I'll get to Title II in a second, it distinguishes compounders engaged in traditional pharmacy practice from those making large volumes of compounded drugs without individual prescriptions. So those who wish to remain in traditional compounding that we might know where they're making small amounts for a certain type of illness or for a certain hospital, that type of thing, they stay under the state boards of pharmacy as they are in current law. Now, an entity that neither stays within those limits of traditional pharmacy compounding nor registers as an outsourcing facility, if they don't want to do one of those two, then they are illegally selling unapproved drugs. So that's what it does. It distinguishes. It defines the Food and Drug Administration's role in oversight of these outsourcing facilities. They'll be subject to FDA oversight in much the same way as traditional drug manufacturers are today. FDA will know who these outsourcers are and what they are making. We serve adverse event reports about compounded drugs and have authority and resources to conduct risk-based inspections. In other words, the lines of responsibility are more clearly defined. I give much credit to my friend from Tennessee for continually, that's about raising the flag. Who has the flag? Who was responsible? Because we found out there was sort of a confusing mess for everybody about who was responsible and who wasn't. And thanks to Senator Alexander, we have cleared that up in this bill. The bill offers providers and patients better information about compounded drugs. It directs FDA to make a list of FDA-regulated outsourcing facilities that will be available on their website. Requires detailed labeling of compounded drugs, prohibits false and misleading advertising, and finally, it clarifies current federal law regarding the pharmacy compounding. It strikes the unconstitutional provisions that were in current law, which kind of led to a lot of this mess. We had different courts in different parts of the country interpreting it differently. So anyway, it resolves that patchwork, applies a uniform standard nationwide. Now that's Title I. Now Title II of the bill is the track and trace provisions. And basically, this committee, again working in a bipartisan fashion a little over a year ago, as you may remember, we brought an FDA user bill to the floor. It passed, signed by the President. That cleared up the upstream part of where drugs come from. In other words, from initial, from the plant derivation to the distilling of the product to everything, all the way up to the manufacturer. So now we have a much better regulation, clearer pictures of drugs that come from China and Indonesia and U.S., no matter where they come from, up to the manufacturing standpoint. What we didn't have at that time was a real understanding of or an agreement on how to control it from the manufacturer down to the consumer. So our committee got involved in this, and again, Senator Alexander helping to lead the way with Senator Bennett and Senator Burr for almost 2 years. Working on this issue. And so now we have this system, and I think this chart kind of shows it. As I said, everything up to the manufacturer we took care of in the FDA user bill. Now this bill takes care of everything from the manufacturer down to the dispenser, that is, down to the consumer. So no matter where the drug goes, whether it goes directly from a manufacturer to a wholesaler to a dispenser, or whether it goes from here to a secondary wholesaler, another secondary wholesaler, another secondary wholesaler. We found that in this country there's a patchwork, there's a kind of all kinds of different ways for a drug to get from a manufacturer down to a consumer. So Senator Burr, Senator Bennett, Senator Alexander, our staffs worked together on this to get this picture put together and to have a track and trace so that we can track the drug. No matter how it goes, we can track it and we can trace it. Now that will come into being over 10 years with electronic interoperable product tracing. Now you might say, well, 10 years is a long time. I would point out the House had 27 years. They agreed with us and made it 10 years, but that's for electronic interoperability. Beginning in January of 2015, yes, January of 2015, they'll have to start paper tracing. So there'll be paperwork, but it'll take 10 years to get it all at a unit level and all electronically and interoperable. And you can understand it takes a long time. Different manufacturers, different suppliers have different systems, and so this will be worked in over that period of time. But we will have traceable after January of 2015. It establishes nationwide drug serial numbers and requires a pathway to unit-level tracing, as I said, strengthens licensure requirements for wholesale distributors and third-party logistics providers. And again, there was a lot of a hodgepodge of different kinds of licensures for wholesalers, and we strengthened that up. And then we, as I said, we have a nationwide serial number established for that, and that will come 4 years after the date of enactment. That will serialize drugs in a consistent way across the country. So again, this is a bill that many might say is long overdue, but better late than never. I'm sorry it took a terrible calamity like the outbreak of meningitis to get us to really focus on this and move it, but it did. And I think this, again, is a good example, again, of where the Congress can work in a bipartisan, bicameral fashion. I met with Chairman Upton on the House side earlier this year talking about a pathway of getting this done. In fact, what we're working on here is the House bill. The House passed it by unanimous consent. And if you've been reading much about the House, you know they don't do a lot by unanimous consent in the House. That just shows you how much work went into the bill and how it was done in a true bipartisan, bicameral fashion. So the House passed it by unanimous consent. And now we have it here, and I dare say, but for a senator or one person, we probably would have passed it by unanimous consent here. I haven't found anyone that's opposed to this bill and who doesn't recognize that it's well supported. We have a plethora of people and industry and consumer support. American Pharmacists Association, American Public Health Association, the Biotechnology Industrial Organization, plus a lot of the big pharmaceutical manufacturers, some of the small pharmaceutical manufacturers. Everyone recognizes that we need a better system to clearly outline who the traditional compounders are and who the outsourcers are, give FDA clear-cut authority over one segment, give the states a clear-cut authority over the other segment. As I said, if you don't fall into one of those two, you're outside the law. So it really does clear it up, and this will ensure the quality and safety of the drugs that patients rely on. I'm hopeful that we have a cloture vote later today. I'm hopeful we'll have a good, strong vote on cloture on this bill. As I said, I can honestly say, standing here, I have not heard one senator from either side of the aisle tell me or inform my staff that they were opposed to the bill, as such, the bill. So, again, I hope we have a strong vote, and I'm going to yield the floor and, again, pay my compliments and my highest respect to Senator Alexander for his leadership on this. His state was hit very hard by this. I know he's very sensitive to that, and I know just from my talks with him, I know that it pained him a great deal to see so much suffering and deaths in his own state. And Senator Alexander got on top of this and pulled us all together and basically said, we got to get it done. So, Senator Alexander, thank you very much. I yield the floor.
The senator from Tennessee.
On behalf of the people of Tennessee that I represent, and I think the American people as well, I want to thank the senator from Iowa for his leadership on these two bills, but particularly on the compounding pharmacy bill. Our differences of opinion in the United States Senate are well advertised on Obamacare, on debt, on Syria, on a whole variety of matters. In fact, you would say that the reason we exist is to debate the big issues that haven't been resolved somewhere else. But there's another aspect of the Senate that is rarely as well advertised, and that's when we get a result. And sometimes the results take a long time, involve a lot of people, and are very difficult to get to. And that is the case with these two bills. And had not Senator Harkin been patient and as well as aggressive at the same time in working with Republicans and Democrats and with members of the House, we would not have gotten till today. I think it's important to call to the attention of the American people this result, because these two pieces of legislation, one which makes it clear who's in charge, as Senator Harkin said, who's on the flagpole when it comes to making sure that the sterile drugs that are injected into your back when you have back pain are safe so that you don't end up with a horrible death from fungal meningitis. Who's responsible for that? And then the second bill is, how are we going to make sure that the 4 billion prescriptions that we have every year in this country are safe, that they're not stolen, that they do what they are supposed to do? How are we going to make sure that we can track them from the manufacturer all the way through to the person who uses them? We've been working on these bills for 2 years. And lest anyone think that because it was a voice vote in the House and because we're close to unanimous consent in the Senate, that it was easy to do. It's not that easy to do. In fact, it's worth going through how this happened before I say just a word to add to what the Senator said about the importance of the bills. The FDA became involved in the fungal meningitis issue in February of 2012, a year ago, after reports from Tennessee that fungal meningitis was tied to a sterile compounded drug. Now, this hits home to many Americans because a great many Americans have been injected in their neck or in their back or in their foot with a drug that's supposed to be sterile. And if it's not, it can have terrible consequences. Immediately, Senator Harkin called a hearing. It was November 15, a year ago, that we had our first hearing. And then within 6 months, we released draft legislation to address the compounding pharmacy issue. We then had a hearing on that legislation. Then we passed the legislation after a lot of comment, all in the open. Everyone had a chance to weigh in. We passed it unanimously. Now, this committee on which we serve, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, probably reflects the widest span of ideological differences we have in the United States Senate. The Republicans can be very conservative, and the Democrats can be very progressive or very liberal. So you would think it would be hard to get a unanimous agreement. Well, we did. We sent it to the House unanimously. Then the House went to work on it, and they came up with their own version of the bill, taking our work into account. They passed it by a voice vote and sent it back. And so here we are today, Mr. President, with a piece of legislation that has been hotlined. That means that both sides have sent it around to every single office. And all but one senator has agreed that we can pass it by unanimous consent. Now, the senator has that right, And just as I have that right, or the senator from West Virginia or the senator from Iowa has that right, and sometimes we exercise that right. But later this afternoon, we're going to be having a cloture vote, a vote to move to this bill. And that cloture vote is going to succeed. There will be a sufficient number of Republican votes and a sufficient number of Democrat votes to say we're ready to deal with this. And why are we ready to deal with this? Because Commissioner Hamburg of the Food and Drug Administration told us at our hearing what would happen if we don't. She said this, quote, "We have a collective opportunity and responsibility to help prevent further tragedies. If we fail to act," the FDA commissioner said, "this type of incident will happen again. It is a matter of when, not if, I'm afraid. If we fail to act now," she told us, "it will only be a matter of time until we're all back in this room asking why more people have died and what could have been done to prevent it." Now, no one is saying that this legislation is going to guarantee that there will never, ever be a tragedy again, but it will help prevent future tragedies. It will take up the responsibility that she challenged us to do, and now that we've spent 2 years on, a year on it, and so many people have been involved, it's time that we move to do it. So my hope is that after the cloture vote tonight, that very soon thereafter, after everyone's had a chance to speak and to say what they have to say, that we can pass this by unanimous consent, send it to the President, and say to the American people that our differences are well advertised, but that our results can be equally important, and that we can pass a piece of legislation which, when taken with the track and trace legislation which accompanies it, affects the health and safety of every single American, period. Every single American. I know the people of Tennessee would welcome a prompt solution to this, and that's what I hope we have. Senator Harkin, as he often does, spoke in very personal terms about this legislation. Let me just tell one story from Tennessee so that we can know what we're talking about here. Diana Reed, 56, Tennessee. She had tried massage and acupuncture, but neither eased her neck pain. One of the potential causes for her pain was an injury sustained while helping her husband, who had Lou Gehrig's disease, in and out of the wheelchair. Diana Reed was healthy, either ran or swam every day, in addition to becoming Wayne's arms and legs and voice, according to her brother Bob. She decided to try a series of epidural steroid injections for her neck problems, and wanted them before her health insurance ran out after losing her job at a nonprofit group. This decision ended her life on October 3rd of last year. She began receiving injections on August 21, with a total of 3 scheduled, 1 every 2 weeks. She felt pain and nausea for a full day after the first 2 injections. After the third, she began having headaches. September 23, she finally agreed to go to a doctor. She was quickly diagnosed with meningitis. While she remained stable for a few days and was mostly concerned about her husband's well-being, now remember, he has Lou Gehrig's disease, and getting home to him as soon as possible, she took a turn for the worse. Her speech began to slur, she had trouble seeing, and eventually she had a stroke. A day later, she was in a coma. 1,000 people packed Otter Creek Church for her funeral, among them the alumni of a child care and learning center for inner-city preschooler that she and her husband had founded. The autopsy found fungal meningitis at the injection site, and in Mrs. Reed's brain. Mr. Reed has a rare form of ALS that worsens more slowly, and his mind has not been affected. Diana Reed would help him get in and out of bed, the shower, and his wheelchair. She became more instrumental in his accounting business as his speech worsened. After her death, members of their church brought meals and did laundry, and the church accepted donations to hire help to assist Mr. Reed with his personal care. That is just one story of the tragedy that the commissioner of the FDA says will happen again if we don't act, and we believe this bill will help to prevent such a tragedy. Steroid injections last year were meant to ease the pain of hundreds of Americans and many Tennesseans, and instead it became their worst nightmare. These vials of contaminated medicine, compounded medicine, were contaminated. 64 Americans, including 16 from my state, died from the outbreak. It's a horrible way to die. When the HELP Committee held its first hearings on this tragic outbreak in November of last year, we looked at how could this possibly happen. It became clear that these contaminated vials were produced in a facility that was nothing like a traditional pharmacy, a corner drugstore, if you will. It operated more like a manufacturer. But it was unclear which regulator was in charge. Was the state in charge, or was the FDA in charge? I made it clear at the beginning of the hearing that my priority was to find a way to clarify who is accountable for large-scale drug compounding facilities, who is on the flagpole for overseeing the safety of drugs made in these facilities. I used the example of Hyman Rickover and the nuclear navy in the 1950s. Admiral Rickover was doing something new. He was doing something dangerous. He was putting reactors, potentially dangerous, he was putting reactors on submarines and ships, and no one knew quite how that was going to work. So what did he do about it? Admiral Rickover hired the captain. He interviewed the captain. He said, first, you're responsible for your ship, and second, you're responsible for the reactor. And if there's ever a problem with the reactor, your career's over. Well, Mr. President, the United States Navy has never had a death on a nuclear ship as a result of a reactor problem, because everyone knew after Admiral Rickover made those decisions who is on the flagpole. There should be no confusion after this bill is passed and signed by the President who is on the flagpole for a particular facility that makes sterile drugs. We should be able to walk into any one of our 60,000 drugstores or pharmacies or to our doctors or pain clinics and not have to worry about whether the medicines we get there are safe. The bill we are voting on represents that year of work that we talked about to find a solution. Today, we have drug manufacturers on the one hand and traditional pharmacies, the corner drugstore, on the other. This legislation creates a new voluntary third category, which we call outsourcing facility. If a drugstore chooses to be in this category, they follow one nationwide quality standard, and the FDA is responsible for all the drugs made in that facility. FDA is on the flagpole. What's the advantage of this? Well, first, it eliminates the confusion. It eliminates the finger pointing. If, heaven forbid, this should happen again, it will be clear whose fault it was, who didn't do their job of regulating. But second, it provides an option available to doctors and hospitals who, if they choose to, can choose to buy all their sterile drugs from a facility regulated by the FDA. Outsourcing facilities are subject to regular FDA inspections. The New England compounding center that caused these problems was not inspected by the state or the FDA from 2006 to 2011. Outsourcing facilities must report the products made at the facility to the FDA. The New England senator that caused the problems was making copies of commercially available drugs, which is illegal. Outsourcing facilities must report to FDA when things go wrong with a product. Currently, large-scale compounders don't have any required reporting to FDA if they know about a problem with a product. And finally, outsourcing facilities, this new category, must clearly label their products so patients know it's compounded rather than FDA approved. Traditional pharmacy compounders will continue to be primarily regulated by the states, but for outsourcing facilities, the FDA is in charge. During our discussions, we heard a lot about drug shortages, and the senator from Iowa and I worked especially to deal with that. We tried to address it where appropriate in this legislation. We know that compounded products aren't the answer to drug shortages. We don't want compounded products to be the backup solution to drug shortages. We want a better answer than that. We recognize the problem, tried to address it here. Because of heroic actions of state officials with the Tennessee Department of Health, more people didn't get sick from the outbreak last fall. I don't intend to sit through another hearing where FDA can point the finger at someone else instead of taking responsibility or claim it doesn't have enough authority. And if we pass this legislation, FDA won't be able to. This legislation also establishes clear rules for outsourcing facilities, puts FDA on the flagpole for drugs made in those facilities. I hope that my colleagues will vote this afternoon to move to the bill, and that shortly after that we will be able to move to unanimously approve it as the House did. Now, just one other comment, Mr. President. The chairman, the senator from Iowa, as well as Senator Burr, Senator Bennett, and others, have been working for at least 2 years on this form of legislation we call track and trace. It's been through the vetting. I think everybody's had a chance to read it, to make a suggestion about it. There have been many changes and adjustments to make sure that it works. Here's this problem. In the United States today, we have about 4 billion prescriptions written every year. We don't have a uniform system to track and trace these drugs once they leave the manufacturer, which makes it easier for counterfeits and substandard products to enter the market and puts patients at risk. The laws governing the tracking of drugs haven't been updated since 1988. In the last 2 years alone, there have been 3 cases of counterfeit Avastin, a cancer drug being distributed in the U.S. to physicians and patients when the counterfeit did not contain any of the active ingredient. We've seen an increase in drug theft. We've got no way of knowing even when these drugs are resold in the U.S. supply chain. In 2009, insulin stolen from a truck months earlier was sold by pharmacies, and the insulin was ineffective due to proper storage. Stealing drugs has turned into a big business. And without assurance that drugs are stored under certain conditions and handled correctly throughout the supply chain, the drugs may not work. This legislation would set up a system over time, 10 years, where products that are stolen could be flagged as such, preventing distribution to patients. It represents a consensus on establishing a national system for all prescription drugs to have a specific serial number on the bottle. That means wholesalers, repackagers, pharmacies will be able to check the serial number on the bottle with the manufacturer to see if that number was assigned by the manufacturer. The serial number will not only help prove that it is not counterfeit, but the information can also be used to determine if anything else has been reported about that bottle, including if the product was stolen. This won't happen overnight. Creating a system that traces 4 billion prescriptions made by over 80 manufacturers on over 3,600 manufacturing lines that are dispensed to patients through a variety of ways will take some time. But the path laid out for us over a number of years will assure the U.S. drug supply chain is secure and that consumers receive drugs that work. I want to thank the senator from Iowa, as I have already, for his leadership on these 2 extraordinary pieces of legislation. Senator Burr and Senator Bennett on the track and trace legislation. Senator Roberts, Senator Franken worked hard on compounding legislation. Let me end where I began. The FDA commissioner challenged us, Mr. President. She said, if we don't act, this tragedy will happen again. We have an opportunity to act tonight. I hope that we do. The families who were devastated by this tragedy of contaminated sterile injections that created fungal meningitis in many of our states, especially in Tennessee, expect us to act. If we do, it will be not as well advertised as the differences of opinion that we can have in the United States Senate, but it will demonstrate how, when we work together over a period of a couple of years, that we can take a very big piece of complex legislation, in fact 2, that affect the health and safety of every American, and come to a consensus that takes a large step forward. I thank the President. I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.